All right, everybody, welcome. I'm going to let everyone kind of filter in for today's conversation, but excited to welcome you to this special virtual event about ultimately how do we strengthen sports-based youth development organization post-COVID-19. Optimistically post-COVID-19, we may still be with COVID-19, but certainly leaning in that direction. So we're excited to welcome you to the conversation. My name is Jeremy Goldberg. I'm the president of a company called LeagueApps, a technology company that many of you may be familiar with, others may not. That helps really serve as the operating system for the youth and local sports industry. And I could not be more excited to be part of today's conversation. You know, one of the things I think about is, one thing I should start by saying is we're honored to have been collaborating with Laureus and their great work for Sports for Good as part of this event. And one of the things that, when I think about Laureus, I think about Nelson Mandela's famous speech about sports at their inaugural awards. And we have this quote that's been in every office that LeagueApps has had about the power of sports to change the world. And I think that's nowhere more evident than in the great work that sports-based youth development organizations are doing. And I think that's never been more true today. We're excited. We've been running virtual events for the past 10 weeks now, and we're excited to do an event very specifically for the nonprofit sector with some incredible experts as part of an incredible discussion to really figure out how we can help you all build capacity and deliver more value at a time when we know that people are counting you like never before, and you're also under more stress and pressure than ever before. This is a personal topic that's near and dear to me. I spent time in the nonprofit sector and had experience, and actually under the tutelage of Bob Osborne initially, I think I raised about $50 million and figured out ultimately how to bring resource into an organization. I learned how to lead and lead organizations. Rehana and I met at the very beginning of my career and applied a lot of my knowledge about communities and building people together in my experience in the Obama campaign. And as leader at LeagueApps, we've made this commitment through Fund Play to pledge 1% of our revenue to ultimately make sure that the more than 500,000 kids from underserved communities have access to sport in the next few years. So we're always looking for ways to have an impact. And I've spent lots of time in the nonprofit sector and working with nonprofits, trying to figure out how to ultimately help you all do your amazing work. And as a level set for today's conversation, I think one thing to start with is recognizing that before COVID even hit, there was already incredible challenges that as organizations you were already dealing with. In the context of sports, there was incredible inequity where, you have over 60% of kids that were really not part of the youth sports system. And when you looked at that split, if your household income was over 100,000, your participation rate was over 70%. And if it was below 25,000, that participation rate was less than 30%. And that to say is nothing about access to fields and access to quality coaches. So the work that organizations were doing in the sports field was already critical. And then you have COVID and it hits. And the reality, as we all understand, is that the inequities that were only magnified by this crisis and only got greater, right? Whether it's the disproportionate impact in terms of health outcomes and where COVID hit, challenges of unemployment, education systems and their ability to go virtual and adapt to this environment, the communities that are most marginalized were often the most impacted. And as organizations, you're now faced with responding to that. On top of which is we know how hard it is to lead your organizations right now. And the challenge as it relates to how you're working with donors and boards and even accessing space to be able to run your programs. So the paradox here is, on one hand, your work has never been more needed. On the other hand, your organizations have never been more challenged. And we believe as leaders that you're in a position to rise to the occasion. And at LeagueApps in this panel, we want to do what we can to help elevate and put you in a position to make that happen. There's tremendous opportunity that all of us have. One is because I think there's increasing recognition of the power of sports as a platform. You see that with athletes in the best tradition of Muhammad Ali and Tommy Smith and Jackie Robinson leading the way right now in a conversation around equity and justice and anti-racism. You also see conversations about shifting funding and resources as opposed to just policing to more community-based programs, the kinds of programs that are represented on the call today. As a society, we're also asking ourselves questions that we haven't asked really fundamentally before. And a lot of that is coming down to questions about we are doing individually and as organizations to dismantle systems of oppression and racism and inequity, and the opportunity for all of us to be part of the solution. So out of that recognition comes the opportunity for innovation, for new partnerships, for new development, for new programming, new funding. And that's the spirit by which we'll have the conversation today. And I can't help but channel Muhammad Ali, who I've always read and consumed anything I can read about him, where he had this great quote that said, "A man who views the world the same at 50 as he did at 20 has wasted 30 years of his life. A man who views the world the same at 50 as he did at 20 has wasted 30 years of his life." And what I would extend that analogy in this context of COVID is there starts to be this return to play, resumption of programming, the work that you all are doing if we're viewing the world the same way we did pre-COVID, we're missing the opportunity, because there's challenges and there's opportunities that are different. And if we can embrace that, ultimately it'll allow us to all be more successful and impactful. So with that, I'm excited to welcome in an incredible panel. As I alluded to before, people that I've known personally that I consider personal mentors and friends of mine. So I'll start by introducing Rehanna Farrow. She is the executive director of YouThink. She started that in January 2015. But she's got an incredible experience in the private sector before that, whether it was Kane Hoy, whether it was Guggenheim, or the time that she spent at Merrill Lynch and Prudential. And I had the opportunity, my first job out of school, Rehana was on the client side when I was a consultant, and she made an incredible impact on me then, and I haven't let her out of my life since. So when I thought about people who could think about, ultimately, how do we help nonprofits to improve and build capacity, the work that she's doing at YouThink and what she's done in career made her a logical stop. So thank you, Rehana, for joining us. Also welcome Bob Osborne. And as I mentioned, Bob Osborne is someone I worked with when I was in a nonprofit sector, trying to figure out what fundraising was all about. And he's, for over 25 years, have been working with leading nonprofits, including some experience in the sports-based youth development space and in the education space. He's the president of the Osborne and principal of the Osborne Group. And he has been an incredible mentor to me. And everything I know about fundraising and by derivative sales came from things that Bob said way back when, even if he didn't realize it. So thank you, Bob, for making me look good all these years. Next, we have Danielle Pulliam, who's a program officer of the Pinkerton Foundation, which is a highly respected foundation that many of you are familiar with. One of the things that I think is kind of representative of this panel, but certainly Danielle, is she brings different kinds of experience to this conversation. So not only is she a funder and brings that perspective, but she has experience as computer science and management. She was at an interesting consultant that's now Accenture. And then has been part of the Stanley Isaacs Neighborhood Center and then United Way. So she brings a lot of different experiences to the table, in addition to the perspective she brings from Pinkerton. So thank you, Danielle, for joining us and for especially making time from the beach. And then last but not least, we have Kim Sabo-Flores, who's the CEO of Algorhythm. And one of the things that I think when we think about organizations and the work that you're trying to do, the question of how you measure impact, how you tell the story of data, is a critical one. And as the CEO of Algorhythm, she brings unique perspective to that kind of conversation. And she's worked with Rehana at YouThink, and not to mention work with government and UN agencies and all kinds of incredible nonprofits. So thank you, Kim, for being with us as well. So with that, I'm going to start with a last minute of housekeeping. I should mention, we want to make this interactive. So I know a lot of people have shared questions in advance that have made their way to us. But if you want to ask a question, just go to the Q&A tab. If you click on that and type a question, anybody can view it and you can upvote it. So it tells me some of the questions that have the most energy and focus behind it. So I'll start with you, Rehana, and pose this question, which is, as you know, we think about this period that we've gone through, and now as we're moving in this period where the country's opening back up, when you think about organizations that have made it through these difficult times and that are poised to be successful, what are those attributes of those kinds of organizations that are positioning themselves for success?
Thanks, Jeremy. I always like to describe the executive directors and their leadership teams of the 75 organizations in the YouThink network as having the same mandate as the CEO of a large bank and all of the bigger financial institutions where I spent my career prior to joining the nonprofit sector. They do the same amount of innovation, the same amount of creativity, the same amount of dedication, commitment. They just don't have the same resource. And so this pandemic was no different. And the amount of, I'll say, ingenuity, tenacity, and just passion and zeal that our nonprofits showed for the young people in their programs. And just a question of like, well, if we can't be in person, we're still going to help our young people. So how are we going to do that? There was never a question in any of their minds about like, well, maybe we'll just shut down for a period of a few weeks or a few months. And so the speed at which they leapt into action and began to innovate was impressive. Digital fundraising, digital programming, collaboration across partners, where you now find not just sports-based youth development organizations collaborating, but some that are dance and other creative youth development organizations, all working together to create a rich curriculum to engage young people. My own young people, not so young anymore, 15 and 13, are really getting Zoom fatigue. And so all of our nonprofit partners are now experiencing that as well. So everyone is thinking about, how do I mix it up? If I'm typically sports-based, how am I adding, things that are creative-based or other ways of engagement? So it's been a really inspiring, albeit tiring, last 3 months. And what I'm really excited for now is how nonprofits can lead. You mentioned everything that everyone is facing right now, which we are long overdue to face and reckon with as a country. So I'm really excited to see how so many of our nonprofit partners who have done so much more work in diversity, equity, and inclusion can now lead some of our corporate partners in this really important work.
It's such a great point, and I think as you talk about the organizations adapting, the reality is that there can be permanent features of those innovations that ultimately can make organizations better. You know, Bob, I'm curious from your perspective, when you think across the landscape of nonprofits that you've worked with, especially from the fundraising side, you know, how do you, what are the attributes of organizations that you're seeing that are figuring out ways of thriving, especially when it comes to being able to maintain donations or potentially attract new donations at a period like this?
Jeremy. Yeah, so I think there's definitely some specific attributes of organizations that are going to do well, in my opinion. It's hard to tell yet, you know, how this is all going to work out. But I would say, you know, the last economic downturn, what I noticed was that a lot of organizations just kind of cut their budgets and didn't really think strategically about what happens next. And I'm happy to say that this time around, those lessons seem to have been learned. I find that now people are really thoughtful. I've seen lots of our clients go into strategic planning mode and really think about, well, what does it mean for us right now? But not just what does it mean for us right now, but what does this mean for us in 2021? What does it mean for us in 2022? And really start to do that deep thinking and really think about, you know, digging into the things that are worrying them, digging into the things that have changed. And so I think that's one attribute, like having strategic planning sort of built into the culture of the organization. And then the other, I would say, is that organizations, and this was true also of the last recession, organizations that have a culture of philanthropy and of stewardship, organizations that reach out to their donors on a regular basis. You know, we're advising all of our clients right now, you know, check in with your donors, see how they are, but also check in with your donors and remind them that they've made a difference, that remind them that, you know, that the money that they've donated, the time that they've donated has had an impact. And, you know, what happens usually is not that giving smaller number of organizations, and the organizations that get the gifts are the organizations that have strong relationships with their donors. So I would say those two things, having a strategic mindset and organizations that are stewardship oriented.
It's great. You know, Bob, one of the things that I see, and I'll post this Harvard Business Review article that I read, it's not specifically about nonprofits, but I think the analogy is apt, is they went back and looked at every major recession and said, okay, after that kind of disruption, what kind of organizations, what happened to organizations, who succeeded? And about 9% of organizations that went through those periods ended up thriving when you look 3 years out from that period of recession. The majority of organizations kind of middled around, and then a number of organizations went under. And when you looked at the common denominators between those that succeeded and really thrived and those that didn't, it wasn't the organizations that simply retrenched and cut costs and basically just tried to wait it out, right? Those organizations didn't succeed. On the other hand, organizations that basically said, we had a strategic plan, we're going to keep on going, we're going to spend the same way, we're going to do the same things, they also weren't successful. It was the organizations, they described them as, in the article, as progressive organizations that had a mixture of offense and defense that were successful, where they figured out new mechanisms of efficiency, where they could reallocate costs, but they also focused on innovation. What are the ways that they could respond and do things differently, right? R&D, marketing, the way they're communicating. And so to me, I think the organizations that figure out that mix are where ultimately they'll be successful. So, and I'm glad you mentioned stewardship, because one of the key things I learned from you was that concept of stewardship. So we're going to get back to that in a second.
Right.
Danielle, to bring you into this conversation, you obviously sit in the lens of a funder, and everybody always wants to understand what exactly a funder is thinking about. So this is, I think, interesting and exciting for everybody here. When you are looking at your grantees and you've been navigating this period of COVID, what are the attributes you're seeing among those organizations that you think are adapting in ways that are increasing the likelihood of how you want to support or get involved with those kinds of organizations?
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, I think that the organizations that are adapting, they're being responsive. They're, to Bob's point, they're checking in with their funders, they're checking in, letting us know what's going on, letting us know how they're pivoting. And, you know, to your sports analogy, how are they being defensive? How are they being offensive in this time? A lot of our organizations that we support, they can't do their normal business, but they are still working, and they're doing more work in response to this COVID pandemic to support the young people in their programs. So they're telling me about that. They're letting me know, like, and also, you know, that then they have grants, so they have to figure out, how do I can we use the funds to do this? We're still serving these students, but we're not doing what we said we were going to do. And we're human, at the Pinkerton Foundation, we're able to, we have some flexibility to say, okay, you're still using the money for the youth in the program, we want to support you. But I think that conversation is key, that, relationship is key, being flexible, they're still doing work. So I think that those are the key things, is maintaining those relationships, being flexible, figuring out ways to help the young people in their programs, and not just, say we can't do this the way we, because everything's different now. So I think, to your point about how some of these organizations, they're finding new programs, they're doing things virtually, they're doing Zoom workout sessions, they're doing activities over virtual sessions, and they're able to interact with their young people in new ways, and keep those connections, and then find out what the young people need beyond, most of it now is a lot of mental health, a lot of social emotional support, and that's what they're providing. And if they can't provide it, they're making those connections. So those relationships, not only with their funders, but other people who work in that space, is very important.
Yeah, as you speak, the two things that jump out at me is, one, there was a communications expert we had that came and talked. And they basically said, bad news is not like wine. It doesn't age well, right? And so at the end of the day, if you're shut down or there's things that are impacted, if you don't say anything, people are going to fill that gap with the worst ideas in their mind of what might be going on. So even if you're coming in and you don't have good news, or you're not sure, there's uncertainty, your ability to communicate with that. No one, I think, going back to Rehanna's point about leadership, no one expecting the leaders to have all the answers. But as a leader, if you can communicate what the challenges are, it allows, I think, people to believe that you're on top of that. So I think it's, I think it's a great point, and from the perspective of a funder, understanding kind of how you view things. Kim, to bring you into the conversation, one is, it may be helpful for everyone to understand the one sentence on Algorhythm. But second of all, is can you speak about a little bit, when you think about organizations that are going to be able to drive more impact at a time like this, what are the common denominators of those organizations that you think are figuring out ways to increase the kind of impact they have, despite all the uncertainty and dynamics with COVID and the economy as well?
Well, I want to build on something. I'll come back to that, I think, or maybe I'll get to it by way of addressing something that Danielle said, and then also something that Bob said. But Danielle, I think that point about checking with funders is fantastic, and kind of level setting. I'm in mid-evaluation with a lot of folks right now who are using our Hello Insight platform, which is an online platform that helps people measure research-based experiences that young people are having and kind of social emotional learning outcomes, right? So they've been really getting on the phone, calling their funders, saying, actually, maybe right now isn't the time for a post-test, because whatever we're going to see in terms of their social emotional well-being isn't really going to be indicative of our program, right? Some people actually want to move forward with a post-test because they feel like they want to see how the transition to online actually went for young people, right? Some people are pivoting and just doing this check-in with young people, which is the point you were trying to make, Danielle, which is, how are young people doing right now? What's going on with them? And they're using that survey as a starting point for conversations with young people about how they're doing social and emotionally right now. So I think that's one way that people are responding in this moment in terms of connecting with funders and level setting what are the outcomes that they can be expecting to see right now, given whatever we said before is happening, what's really happening. Those are two different things. But then how do we pivot the use of our tools and resources to finding out just how young people are doing, what's going on with them right now? And so I'm seeing a lot of creative approaches in that in that area, including a lot of people who are doing kind of youth participatory action research to have young people research this moment for themselves. I have a group of seniors at Eagle Academy who are doing a legacy project, studying their own social and emotional well-being and creating a project for the peers that they have at the Academy. So there's some really innovative things going on right now, I think, in terms of evaluation. And there's something I think, Bob, you were saying also, which was really critical, which is what we can learn from the last economic downturn. And I think in many ways, Algorhythm and our product Hello Insight was born out of the last economic downturn. And the reason we were born out of the last economic downturn is that what happened in the last economic downturn, I was a consultant in New York. I was doing lots of evaluation. And I felt like this was a time for me to move out of evaluation, and I did grant making, But it was a time for me to move out of evaluation, because I felt like funders will need to pivot their resources into programming, right? And that evaluation would be an extra, an add-on, something that would be great a couple years from now, but not now, right? But that's not what happened. In fact, the opposite of that happened. I would say that the American Evaluation Association exploded. Probably we grew tenfold during that period of time, because I think funders got more, wanted to make sure that the resources they were spending were going to programs that were having an impact, right? So they doubled down on evaluation. I think this notion that, I don't know if people have heard of randomized control studies were the gold standard, but the ramp up of how much people wanted from evaluation and impact measurement increased. And the inequity of who got access to evaluation and who didn't get access to evaluation widened. It really matches the same disparities we see everywhere else. Small community-based organizations who work in communities that are most often the most difficult to reach were defunded or are greatly decreased, and larger funders, larger organizations that were able to prove their impact continue to increase, grow, and scale. And so, we grew out of that movement because we really wanted to create an online platform that drove down the cost of evaluation drastically for small to medium-sized nonprofits who would never be able to afford a randomized control study, yet needed rigorous research-based tools and analytics that would help them prove that they were making a difference.
Yeah, that's really helpful to think about. And Bob, maybe to bring you back in the conversation, so you've got this dynamic where, I think the best way to sum it is some organizations are going to figure out how to get through this and ultimately thrive. And if other organizations, if they're not adapting, if they're not measuring, they're not making adjustments, they may miss that opportunity or ultimately be hurt by it. I think a central challenge every organization is going to think about is, wait, I have more people I need to serve, but I also have to generate the revenue for it. And there's the revenue I had that may be at risk. And then there's the question of, can I attract new revenue in response to kind of the broader demand? So first is, I don't know if you can comment about what you see as the broader landscape, where you're seeing companies announce commitments. Some foundations are coming up with more creative strategies to be able to ramp up their giving. Do you see a better fundraising environment, or do you, is that a dynamic you see, first of all? And then second of all is, when you think about organizations and the strategies they're using to capitalize on right now, the best way to lead their fundraising programs, what are a couple of the best pieces of advice you can give about the kind of fundraising that they maybe should be focusing on in this period of time in response to kind of those market dynamics?
Sure. So yeah, no, I wouldn't say it's a great time for fundraising. I think it's probably going to be a pretty challenging time for fundraising, or at least I think that's the assumption we have to go into this period with. I mean, I'll be happy if, 6 months from now, this turns out to have been a blip, but I would be, if I was running a not-for-profit, I would be assuming that there's going to be some kind of downturn of some kind, and possibly a protracted downturn. So it remains to be seen what the trends will be, but we can kind of look back to the last recession and see that giving went down, but it didn't go down huge amounts. It did go down. It maybe went down 10, 20%. I think, it wasn't this massive loss of giving, but I think what did happen was it got a lot more competitive. And I don't think not-for-profits always think about the fact that they're in a market, and that people, that you're essentially competing against other not-for-profits. And so, if I'm giving $10,000 away a year, perhaps I will give, before maybe I was giving $10,000 a year to 10 organizations. Now maybe I'm giving $7,000 away for 2 organizations or 3 organizations. And so you want to be one of those 2 or 3 organizations, and you want to do the things that are going to help you successfully compete in a tighter marketplace. And so I would say a couple of things you can do. I mean, one, you have 2 assets. You have your board and you have your donors. Those are the 2 things that you have. And this is an area, I mentioned stewardship before. You really can't overdo the stewardship. Most organizations do a terrible job of stewarding, if they do it at all. It's something that you should be doubling down on and doing as much as you possibly can. I think reach out to your donors now. If I cared about baseball before, just because of COVID doesn't mean I don't care about it anymore. I might have a different situation. I might have to think harder as a donor about how I can be helpful, but I still care about it. And if asked and communicated to well, there's a decent chance that I'll give. The other piece of advice I've been giving people is this is a great time to do a survey of your donors, whether that's like a formal online survey or calling up people and talking to them, in person and getting a sense of things. Like what you don't want to find out is 6 months from now is that you're not a priority for an organization, because by then it'll be difficult to do something about it. So right now, if I'm a not-for-profit, I want to know, where do I stand with my donors, and what can I do right now to improve that standing if it needs to be improved. And so doing some kind of, again, formal donor survey, or just having conversations in an informal way and kind of figuring out, well, where am I, is going to give you the most valuable piece of information you can get, because right now nobody really knows what's going to happen, right? Like we can predict, we can talk about it, but if I can figure out a sort of an empirical way right at this moment to give me a sense of what the situation is for me personally and what I need to do to improve on that situation, that's the thing that I probably want to do. So it's the same thing that that a lot of us are saying is talk to your supporters, talk to your stakeholders, figure out where you are, and that'll give you a good sense of what you're going to need to do going forward.
Hey, going back to a couple of practical tips you taught me way back when about stewardship, one is, and a donor engagement, I think the way you taught me was this idea that if you could, how do you make people experience the joy of giving over and over again, not just tied to that time they made the gift? Because you felt a certain way when a donor made the gift to your organization. Hopefully you made them feel that way. So how do you make them experience that joy of giving over and over again, well after that they made that gift? And the second thing you taught me, I think you taught me, if not, I made it up and told my teams about this, which is if you give people 3 reasons for a reason to meet, you can pretty much get any donor meeting you need. So always come in with 3 reasons, and then it's like too hard for them to say no. So if one of those reasons is like, hey, I'd love to ask you a set of questions about how we're thinking about our strategy moving forward. It'd be great to get your advice, in addition to giving you an update in the organization, and also learning more about, kind of what you're focused on right now. Those are 3 really good reasons to be able to get in the door and get a meeting. So anyway, the rule of 3 was something I borrowed from you way back when, that it's at least it was hard for people to say no after that.
I did teach you those things.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, the 3 reasons worked really, really well. And yeah, experiencing the joy of giving again over and over is really important. Again, I think I start to get on my soapbox about this, but organizations don't do enough stewardship. And right now, if you cannot overdo this, you're probably underdoing it by quite a bit. Let people know the impact of their giving today if you haven't done it. And the other thing I would add to that is right now, I think people need to know that there's a plan. I think Danielle had mentioned that people are reaching out to her and saying, here's what's changed. I think that's really important too. Like, how are you, not just to your funders, but to, any individual donors you have, corporations, let people know that we've thought about this and we know how it affects our mission and we know how it affects the people that we serve, and we've given it some deep thought, and here's the plan. In other words, your gifts, your continued giving will make a difference. We've thought it through. So I think communicating not just the joy, which is really, really important, but also like the competence of your organization is a key thing to do right now as well.
So Rehana, to bring your perspective, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, as somebody who does run a nonprofit right now, I agree with everything Bob just said. If I could have taped this and then literally taken it back to my team, if there's a download afterwards, I definitely want it. I think those are great words of wisdom. And to your point, Jeremy, that you made earlier about if you don't say something, people fill in the blanks. As an executive director, that continues to amaze me, of like just what people will make up in the absence of me having said what I obviously should have said. At the same time, I feel like we have done a decent job of stewardship as it's been borne out by our conversations with our board. We've been in weekly communication with them. Our executive committee met weekly for the month of April just to make sure that everything was on track. And then our board giving to date has been flat to up. And so we haven't seen a drop off yet, knock on wood. And our corporate giving so far has been fine. We're also seeing companies stand up funds for COVID that are new funds that are not decreasing old pots of money. And then now funds for racial equity, which is unprecedented in my experience in the nonprofit sector as well as my corporate career prior. So it feels like there are more doors. And I think it's hard on especially grassroots nonprofits, which make up the Youth Inc. portfolio, to have enough resource to know who is standing up all these funds and, what are all these criteria, because that just got harder to manage and figure out, what I qualify for and when are those deadlines and who's going to write those grants. So I think it hasn't been bad yet, and I'm still waiting. I feel like a lot of foundations are being called to give more than the 5%, relax reporting requirements, accelerate giving. We at UThink are increasing our grant making, and we have relaxed our reporting and accelerated the payments. And so we're trying to be a good trust-based philanthropy partner to all of our nonprofits who we call partners, not grantees. So I do feel like there are these pots of optimism, even though I recognize where the market is daily, definitely makes people a little reticent on the individual donor level to keep giving at historical levels.
Rhonda, just a quick, maybe if you had a sense of advice, having been inside the top rungs of big corporations that are the same ones that are making this pledges of giving money, it's one end, it's exciting for organizations to think that there's funds around COVID or around racial equity. The other hand, it's going to be pretty daunting to navigate those organizations, for especially smaller based organizations. What advice do you have for organizations that want to think about going after that money, or maybe maybe they shouldn't be thinking about going after that money and prioritizing their energy elsewhere?
Such a good question. They're all so new. We ourselves are learning about them and then trying to translate them immediately to our nonprofit partners and just sharing out every bit of information that we take in. So becoming part of other networks so that you are in that information flow and can learn from other people in terms of what their experience has been, understanding grant requirements, what's written, what's unwritten, which I still think, gets in the way for a lot of people. It's not as simple as what's posted online. So I think that can be great. And then probably focusing your efforts and figuring out how you can reuse, recycle. We internally are so excited when we find a grant opportunity where we feel like we have done something similar and we can leverage a lot of that, because it comes down to bandwidth, certainly at the grassroots level, where you just can't go after every opportunity. So trying to be realistic and honest about how you assess them.
So Danielle, I'm curious, representing kind of Pinkerton and the funding side, how have your priorities or strategies shifted to this time, and how does that translate to the advice you might give for organizations that are out there trying to figure out ways of raising money and building their capacity that way?
Yeah, I think to echo what Rehana said about I think organizations need to be authentic in their work. It's understanding what their mission is. There's a lot of new pots of money, and it might not be relevant to the work that they're doing. So rather than kind of, configure themselves into something new to chase that money, that's definitely not advisable. But I do think there's some organizations that are doing new work legitimately because of, they're seeing how their constituents are needing X, Y, and Z. So it has to be authentic. I think, that showing the actual, how did you get to this new spot? I think that's important. So the advice is really to just be true to your mission. We fund specifically direct services, sports-based youth development programs that have an education component. So we're very specific. So when organizations don't have that, that's, easy. It's easy to just, say no, because that's not what we do. And we do what we do. There's other foundations that might be able to support. So I just think being clear on what your focus is and having those conversations with your board about how you're going to grow your program or how you're going to contract your program. Because now in this environment, there's lots of cuts being made. What program were you struggling with before that wasn't doing that much, adding that much value? Maybe that's where you remove the resources. There's tough decisions that have to be made. So I think, they really have to look at those areas and look at, okay, there's areas where it might still be not making any money for the organization, but this is really your sweet spot, your need. So that's really, you're going to have to put all that extra effort into fundraising for.
Right.
So
Bob, yeah, it does. Bob mentioned this concept of stewardship. Rehana echoed this, and this question of ultimately in an environment where some organizations are looking for more resources, there may be more competition for dollars. Ultimately, it's about how you deepen that relationship and connection with your donors. I'm curious from your perspective, when you think about an organization that may have done something really great that kind of deepen your connection to their work, or how they've communicated with you, or how they've demonstrated the kind of impact that they've made in a way that really resonated, is there a best practice or an example you can give saying that this is something that really has had a powerful impact on me and our foundation with respect to how an organization took your support and was able to demonstrate the kind of both impact with it and made you feel good about the investments you made?
Well, I would say I have a lot of grantees that we support that are able to demonstrate. And it really goes back to communication, not to like, just repeat the same thing over and over again, but it's really, telling that story. A lot of the times we have a reporting cycle and some organizations, I'm only learning about things like during the reporting time. And sometimes it actually would be helpful for me to learn about it sooner. Because not necessarily for us to like, we might not have extra funds at that particular time, but I'm constantly in conversations with my peers in philanthropy, talking about the work that we're supporting. So the more I know, the more I can communicate about, and also be an advocate for, also be on the development team. I see myself as a partner in that sense. I'm also on the development team for the organizations that I support. So I would like to not only, I would like to leverage the Pinkerton dollars that we're putting in with other private and public funds. So that's really the times that I've been able to see that. Like it's really, they've been able to just tell me stories about what's happening. So we have a number of organizations that, in this time have changed their programming, that they're doing, giving out gift cards for groceries. That's not the work that we typically support, but we know that they're actively helping young people. So like there's concrete examples that they're giving me on a real-time stories. And especially now, I think that's really, it's important, the real-time factor. So it puts a lot of pressure on the smaller organizations to get that stuff communicated, but creating space for it is tremendously important.
Yeah, and one thing that was such a good point that I want to pull out too is when you mentioned that you feel like you're part of the development team for the organizations that you're supporting. And one of the kind of advanced things that I think I learned from Bob was through your stewardship, you can actually figure out ways of raising more money. And one of the ways that can happen is you take a foundation, for example, you can say, hey, I want to host, our CEO and talk about our program innovation. Would you host that with me? And we'll invite some other prospective foundations we don't work with. And so one is by bringing them into an event and getting that validation of how other people view that organization, it makes them feel better about their support. Second of all, is their credibility helps you bring in more people into a conversation where you're able to prospect off of that. So there's lots of different ways that the stewardship can also be connected to development, to your point about being part of the fundraising team. Kim, from your perspective, we talked a little bit about impact and evaluation. And the first question that comes to mind here is, it's one thing to say we're going to track data. It's another thing to figure out how to tell that story and use it in a way that helps the organization with their board or with donors, whatnot. So what have you seen as best practices, and what would you recommend, not just about how you capture data, but ultimately how you're utilizing data, both in the context of fundraising and beyond?
Yeah. It's great. It's a great question. So I think, we've been working a lot with YouThink and Rehanna's team on this topic exactly, right? So I think part of the work is kind of also good stewardship, right? I think there's a transparency and a intentionality around what we're going to all consider impact, right? And everybody says that before you start an evaluation, the first thing you want to do is make sure all stakeholders know the purpose of the evaluation first. Seems like a small point, but it's a really big point, right? Because it is often the case that why a board member wants an evaluation is wildly different than why, a program director wants it, right? And the kinds of data that they're looking for and the kinds of findings that they're looking for couldn't be further apart. So if you don't do the due diligence in the beginning to get on the same page about why you're measuring, what you're measuring, what are you trying to accomplish as an organization, and how are you going to get there, then you're going to be off when you start to present the findings to your board or even to funders, right? You're going to have a gap between what you actually have measured and what they're anticipating, right? So I think the more work that you can do in the front end of a study to get clear on what it is that the organization is taking as stake, where they want to go, what the stake in the ground is that they want to have, that's really valuable work to do from the beginning. And I think the thing that is so exciting in this moment about kind of the outcomes of social emotional learning is that in some ways our sector, the sports-based youth development sector and a lot of out-of-school time sectors, we were asked to measure things that were far beyond our control. So how does, ice hockey in Harlem contribute to school-based outcomes in schools that are failing young people in their communities, right? It's a very hard thing to measure. So how do we say, okay, those are all great outcomes, but they're not things that we can actually actualize. Our organization, what we do with young people, ice hockey isn't going to fix the failing school, right? But what can it do? What are the things that we actually can accomplish that are very proximal to what we do with young people, right? And so where I get excited about the social emotional learning aspect is I think that it gets us to a set of outcomes that are a more promising North Star than some of the things we've been asked to measure in the past, which we honestly can't ever prove. And I've done a lot of studies, I've done hundreds of them that have proven that we can't prove it. So I'm pretty sure that we can't. So, but what we can do is we can measure things. And the reason social emotional learning, I think, has become so popular is we know these capacities, when young people have these capacities, that it is more likely that they're going to be career ready, that it is more likely that they're going to do well academically, right? That there's more likelihood of those things. So we can use the social emotional learning outcomes as a proxy measure for those things. And so I think that's critical, and helping to educate your board around why maybe measuring high school graduation rates in our third grade, soccer league isn't probably the most valuable exercise. And we all laugh, but I've been asked to do exactly that. Why that's maybe not the most appropriate set of things to measure, and how if we measure something that's closer to what we actually do and think we can accomplish, that bias over to help make the leap that these things will lead to those things. But getting really clear about that is important.
Quick follow-up question, which is, have any kind of measures of impact shifted since organizations have gone remote? So you mentioned kind of the emphasis with respect to social emotional learning, but is there any other adaptations that you see?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, most of our tools measure both social emotional learning and the best practices or research best practices that we know drive those things. And so a lot of people in this moment, again, have either used just a check-in, not to say how is our program doing or we actualize these outcomes, but just where are young people right now in terms of their social emotional health, right? They just pivoted that way. It's a needs assessment. It's how they're then thinking about how to drive programming forward, based on those needs. But a lot of people have used just a measure of how young people are experiencing this space, right? Are they actually connecting with peers in the same way? Are they connecting with adults in the same way? Are they, so some of the things that we want to see in really good research-based practices are the connections happening, which we know are challenged in this space, the connections between adults, the connections between peers, the opportunities to expand interest. So how are those things playing out in this space, but really driving from a perspective of, let's just look at the good research-based practices that should occur and figure out how we can bring them into this space and how young people are experiencing this space.
That's great. You know what, I can't help but think about, I've said this recently, which is we've gone through the greatest brand exercise ever when it comes to sports-based youth development and sports organizations more generally. Because if I said in January, okay, you're gonna have to deliver and make an impact and add value to the communities you're trying to operate, but you can't actually play the sport, right? Like, we're removing that part of it. What is your value? Now, for a lot of youth sports organizations, they can't answer that question. But sports-based youth development organizations are built to answer that question. And if not anything coming out of this period, any parent of a child who was previously in a youth sports organization that, they couldn't play the sport, but they saw how that organization kind of handled it, saw what their kid was missing or what they experienced. I think there's a greater appreciation and recognition of the broader benefits of sport beyond the game itself. Danielle, just as a quick follow-up there, I'm curious, have any of the measures that you're looking for shifted at all, or the way that you think about defining success, whether it's in the short term or the long term, as it relates to kind of the COVID period, and to the point that Kim was making about some of these adjustments?
Yeah, I mean, I think our mission has remained the same. We're still funding the same. We have the same focus, but to Bob's point about it being a more competitive environment. So I think where the impacts that like a Hello Insight can provide, that is extremely helpful to tell the story of the work and how it's enriching the lives of people. So that's really, you're looking at who's able to tell the story it's really communications and who's able to explain the value of the work that they're, what for your organization, what would happen to these young people, what's that value add, and how do you articulate that, and how are you measuring that, back to Kim's point. So
that's great.
I think that's really important.
So, and one thing I'll say, if people have more questions, I know there are a few that are coming in, feel free to go to that Q&A tab and interject here. Rehana, the first question I have for you as I'm listening to all this stuff, and especially as we get into impact and data, I think about your experience in the for-profit sector and how you now translate that. And as you mentioned, people that are executive directors or CEOs of nonprofits are just like CEOs of for-profits, right? The same challenges of leadership, same dynamics as it relates to how they're dealing with constituencies, leading team, building culture. And one of the things that's been interesting as I sit on nonprofit boards, having worked in the nonprofit sector, but now leading a high growth technology company, is you get a sense of like, oh, wow, what's not happening and what's not often translating in the nonprofit sector. And this question of data and how data science is being used to drive decisions. I certainly see, like, we have multiple data scientists in our team. And I could not now imagine, using and making decisions without that kind of data. And so I'm curious to see how it's one thing to say, I've got to, do an evaluation because our funders are expecting. It's another thing to build a culture of using data to drive decision-making and ultimately how an organization is innovating and leading. What have you seen as the best ways for organizations to do that? Or what are best practices with respect to how they're operating and how they're using data to actually change and adapt, especially in an environment of such uncertainty?
We couldn't agree more, and it's part of why you think coming out of that last financial downturn, I now realize that timing coincides with our board asking us, how do we know that the organizations whose fundraising and governance practices we are improving are actually benefiting the young people in their organization? And that is the question that led to our partnership with Algorhythm, which has been now, I don't even know, Kim, 8 years, 10 years? Like we're getting up there. It's certainly a sector. And things have really changed over that 5 years, Jeremy. If you think back to that first breakfast in February of 2015, I would say SEL was very wonky then. It was lots of PhD speak, and now it is translated. It's a hot topic at Davos. It's everywhere you read about. So people really understand the importance of these skills more so than ever before. But at Youth Inc., we don't emphasize this as like, come into our portfolio, get this measurement so you can go get a grant. That's never been our orientation. It's always been about the learning. And there was one ED who summed it up best when she said, this tool is enabling us to go from instinct to intention. So many of us are parents, probably on this call, certainly those of us on the panel, and there's a lot of it that is your gut instinct about what's the right thing. Now, what if you could actually understand how your kids are different and what you wanted to do differently to get the right outcome with each of them? You would certainly do that. So this is like giving you all of that information in terms of how the young people in your programs are profiling and what they are coming into the room with. And then also evidence-based practices saying, if we know that Jeremy is profiling this way, this one practice is going to move the needle with him more so than another practice. And so that intentionality is so powerful. So we really look for organizations that have a learning orientation and want to improve and grow as a key component. And that's why I think it aligns so well with venture philanthropy, not so different from a high growth technology company. Not saying that all of our nonprofits have to want to grow quickly. You just have to want to learn and grow and evolve. That's really our ethos. Learn and evolve.
One thing I've seen, sitting on a few nonprofit boards is those organizations over the past year have adopted kind of an objective and key results system, or an OKR system. And it's been transformative to the organization because they had a framework then by which to take this data and ultimately measure that back to the objectives they were trying to drive in the organization, whether that's programmatic, whether that's development, whether that's kind of more administrative. There's a great book called Measure What Matters. If people haven't read it, that talks about the application of OKRs. I'm a disciple of and believe in a system like that. So if anyone wants to learn or needs any help, I'm happy to volunteer myself. But it's I think it's important. I think, Rehana, the other question that came in from Robert was had to do with cooperation. It's really interesting to think about whether or not, are there opportunities for sports-based youth development organizations to collaborate in an environment like that? And how does collaborative and partnership models work, in terms of how you ultimately get funding or how you collaborate? And do we think there's more incentives for collaboration, or in a more competitive environment, is there less incentives for collaboration?
Well, it's so interesting that the question was posed that way, because one of the things we find really valuable about YouThink's nonprofit network is the learning communities that we create around different areas, whether it's fundraising, governance, or impact evaluation. And so for us, we've noted that a lot of the time, the only time two sports-based youth development organizations might ever see each other is walking into Danielle's door at Pinkerton, because somebody's walking in at 10 and somebody is walking out at 11, and they're giving each other side eye. And so
Right.
for really think that, you know, the coming together and sharing of best practices is how organizations can learn and grow. So I think there's more opportunity for collaboration, but it's also scary, and it's also got its own host of challenges in terms of, you know, you have typically organizations have their own you know, challenges internally, and so partnering with an external organization just adds to that. But I would say that now in this time, again, when you're trying to think about digital programming and making things different for your young people, the idea that you collaborate with other organizations to mix it up a little, I think is really exciting. One of our board members, Mark Whaling, just started an organization called SAST, Student Athlete Success, maybe it's team, I can't remember what the T stands for, but he said, I'm happy to give everything we're doing for, you know, student athletes to all of your sports-based nonprofits, because whether it's nutrition or stretching or anything else, like all of his programming, he thinks will be somewhat different than their existing program. So just to mix it up, like look for ways to find new partners. I think the next 12 months are going to demand it.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and one in which, you know, whether I've seen this through Laureus's work, but also through some of the collectives that have emerged in specific cities like Philadelphia or Milwaukee, where, you know, I think they're trying to be more intentional about creating that kind of networks and collaborations. Bob, I'm curious from a funding perspective, how does that work? And have you seen models in which organizations not only team up and think about programmatically, but can that create development opportunities as well?
Yeah, well, you know, it's, as Rehana mentioned, I mean, it's I don't see it as much as should probably happen for some of the reasons that she that she outlined, just being that a lot of organizations just have challenge internally without, you know, worrying about bringing in an external organization. But I would say, you know, when it comes to funding, it's all about impact, right? Like the bigger the impact you can promise, the more you can say that something's going to be different tomorrow because of the work we're doing today, the easier it is to get funding. And right now, you know, it's a tight marketplace, like I said before. So to me, if you can partner with other organizations and come up with some way that you can give more value than just your own organization itself, I think that's valuable, and I think that's something that people will be looking for. I think, you know, theoretically, I think it can be done. I think there's lots of challenges around just the management of that kind of thing. But I think for organizations that have that culture and have a culture of openness and sort of you know, open source and sharing, I think it's a potentially valuable way of doing fundraising. I'm sorry to say that I haven't seen a lot of it at this point, with a few exceptions. But who knows? Maybe we'll see some more come out of this. I know that's something that funders would like to see more of.
Yeah, one thing that sorry, go ahead, Rehana, please jump in.
Funders who structure it that way. I myself have only seen one corporate grant where it was only for those who collaborate. We applied for it, we didn't win it, but just even the collaboration of the application was a thing. And so it was just an added layer of complexity. So I think it's totally normal. But to your point about, you know, what we don't know, I think right now the crisis that we're all facing in this country about injustice and inequity is really going to force people to the table, because so many people don't know. So I know that we are not expert at YouThink. I am actively looking for experts to help us. I also know that most of my 75 organizations in the network want to know more. So I think our next learning community will be about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we will be more open because of what we don't know about this idea of collaboration and just understanding best practices.
It's such a good point, and I think especially as it relates to these questions, a lot of what has to happen is personal transformation as leaders, because if you want your organization to think about, you know, questions of diversity and equity and inclusion, and ultimately you want to have an impact through your programming, it's a question of how as leaders we confront our own blind spots, our own sense of privilege and what it may be, and that doing that alone is really hard. Doing that with other people that are exploring that together, I think it can be really, really powerful. I think the other thing, as Bob was talking, I think the question of nonprofit mergers is also something you see consolidation during these periods of time. I've been on boards that have gone through a few different mergers, and sometimes that also can be mechanisms to create more efficiency, respond to kind of competitive environments. Bob, just to bring you in on a quick topic of board management right now, if you had to kind of quickly sum up the best way and dynamics of kind of dealing with boards like this, is there a couple of best practices that you might share?
Yeah, you know, so I would treat your board at this moment very much like I would treat your best donors. Like these are, you know, I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that you really have two assets. You have your donors, your funders, and you have your board. And so you should, one, steward your board. You know, again, make them understand that that they really make a difference. That you're not going to be able to operate without them. You know, this is an opportunity, I think, to build or continue to build a culture of philanthropy with your board. It's important that they see whatever challenges you may be facing as an organization as not your problem as staff, but as a collective responsibility of the organization. And so, you know, sharing fundraising metrics, sharing plans, sharing information right now that brings in your board and make sure they see themselves as part of the solution and help you strategically think about things. I think it's really important because I think the instinct of boards right now is like our job is to look at the budget and start cutting the budget. And that's our job, to be fiscally responsible. When in fact their job really should be to look ahead and say strategically, what do we need to be doing, you know, going forward? What do we need to do tactically right now? But almost more importantly, what do we need to do strategically going forward? So anything you can do to initiate those conversations, to think about those kind of things and include them. I think sometimes we think of our board as something we just have to kind of deal with. We have to have it and we don't use it as an asset. Now is a perfect chance to really, if that's sort of the situation you're in, to transform your board into the asset that you always hoped it would be. And if it already is an asset, to capitalize on that asset. I mean, people have to think right now about what, you know, I'm thinking about what can I give to, what can I give to, what can I do, what can I do? But as I mentioned before, like I still care about all the things that I care about. And I care about the boards that I'm on. And I want them to be successful. And so I will try to do whatever I can within my means to do that. But if I don't know what's needed and if I don't understand the situation and I don't feel like things I've done in the past have been valuable, then I'm less likely for that to happen. So steward your boards.
So as we near to the end, Danielle, maybe you can give us just, you know, in terms of Pinkerton and what you're focused on, you know, talk about the kind of grants you're looking to make, and if organizations are interested in learning more, what's the best way to do that if they want to consider some kind of potential collaboration?
Sure. Just generally, if you're interested in a grant from Pinkerton, we have an LOI process. So you would just go onto our website and submit an LOI. That's just a 2-pager. Because before you submit a full proposal, we want to just, you know, we'll look at that and then we'll invite you formally to do a full proposal. So that's the process. But I do want to go back, if I could just take 1 minute to go back to the point about collaboration, because we were funding a collaborative that Kim was independent consultant for with literacy partners. And one of the values that it's the Reads Initiative. One of the values that came out of that network was they were able to leverage their relationship and get not only funding from Pinkerton, but public dollars, but then also staff-wise. When a couple of organizations had sunsetted, the staff from those organizations were able to move over to. So I think that there's a lot of, especially now as some organizations will not survive this, and that's a reality. But that's that talent, we do not want to lose that in the sector. So how can we bring on that talent into these organizations? I think that's something to think about. And philanthropy, and one more point is just that it costs more money to collaborate. So, and we recognize that. So we did, you know, we paid above, you know, we gave more money for the collaboration. And I think that as a grantee, as a nonprofit partner, to just ask for that, the cost of the work, be honest about the real cost of it, because you don't want to shortchange yourself. It's a lot of work.
Kim, if people are interested in Algorhythm and they want to kind of take your advice and think about evaluation in a time like this, what's the best way to do so?
So I think going to the helloinsight.org website will help you see kind of the tools and resources that we have available. They're very low cost. There's also Laureus Foundation runs a few cohorts. So if you're a Laureus grantee, that may be something for you to be able to opt into. Obviously, if you're a YouThink grantee, you get Hello Insight no matter what. And then we're always running online trainings, and we have a community of 2,000 organizations nationwide that we do professional development with. We run free webinars, and just, happy to help out in whatever way. There's a lot of resources on our website, so take a peek.
That's great. And Rehana, you think if people want to learn more, be part of that network, or be inspired by all the great work you're doing, what's the best way to do that?
Same thing, go to the website. We have a ton of resources up there, from COVID-19, just how to manage crisis communications to, bringing your employees back to work, everything in between. So take advantage of that. And then if you're interested in membership in the partner network, you can just send us an email and we'll be in touch.
And Bob, if people thought you had great advice and wanted to learn more, is there ways to get more of your wisdom?
Sure. Same as everyone else, go to theosborngroup.com. We have lots of free videos and tools up, specifically around COVID, but around a lot of other things as well. And we have a contact form. So.
Perfect. And by final way of wrap up, we've created an industry Slack group for sports organizations across the country. We've specifically created a channel just for sports-based youth development organizations. So if you're interested, we'll post that information and include that in the follow-up and the link to this content. So feel free to join other people, and you can engage for-profits, nonprofits, and again, learn from each other. There's power from the network and the community. Certainly was evidenced today. And then speaking for LeagueApps, if there's ways we can be helpful to your organization, learn more about Fun Play on our website. Under community, you can look for that impact button. And we'll also post that link here. And if we can make technology grants, if we can provide financial support, we can make introductions, whatever we can do to support you, we're eager to do that. So thank you for all your work, and thanks for this incredible panel, for all the advice that you provided, and not just here, but at the beginning of my career. And excited for us to work forward together, and thanks for everyone's hard work. So have a great day. This is Jeremy Goldberg and LeagueApps signing off. Take care, everyone.